Hey everybody, this is Matt here with another chess opening video. This is going to be covering the Grunfeld defense, which is another defense to the pawn to d4 opening from white. The opening goes as follows: knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to g7, g6, knight to c3, and pawn to d5. And this is the Grunfeld defense. The Grunfeld defense is really built on the idea that having a large pawn center can be a liability rather than an asset. Having the pawn center is very susceptible to attacks, and that you're going to really be tying everything down to having to defend rather than being able to take advantage of the pawn center that you made. And in the main line, it's called the exchange variation, and it goes with c captures on d5, knight captures on d5, pawn to e4, attacking this knight. It's not in black's favor to just move it back, because then white could get another tempo by just pushing the pawn up again. And so it's best just to go ahead and capture this knight so that you give white this pawn center that you wanted white to have. But at the same time, you're giving white a lot of targets. These three pawns are going to be coming under a lot of attack later in the game. And so all the black pieces and all the white pieces are going to be defending all these pawns, trying to not lose material. So the main line continues with bishop to g7 and bishop to c4. One variation that you can go for instead of the bishop c4 is the knight to g3. But it's much more ideal to have our knight on e2, because the knight on either square is just going to be defending this pawn. But if it's here, then that gives black the option of bringing this bishop here, and at some point capturing the knight that will be here, and that will take off a defender of your pawn. So that's not very good for white. And the reason we play bishop to c4 first is to get the bishop out of the way so that the knight's not blocking in the bishop. So that's why you see those moves in the main line. So play from here will continue with pawn to c5, putting more pressure on the pawn here. It's no good to capture right now because queens will just trade off, and now white can't castle. It's also not very good to capture in general, simply because black gave white this pawn center, and by capturing this pawn, you're destroying that pawn center that you had. Even if you didn't have this whole queen can't castle scenario going afterward, it's still not good, because you're giving back what black gave you as your main advantage. So you don't want to capture there even later in the game. This pawn was only put here to put another attacker on this pawn here. So that's the reason why you see that. At the moment, we have, as a result of that pawn, we have 3 attackers on this pawn, and we only have 2 defenders. Oops. Oh, if I can quit clicking that. Okay, you only have 2 defenders. And so play from here will continue with the knight come to e2, developing the knight, no longer locking in the bishop, and at the same time defending this pawn again, so that it's got enough defenders to maintain on the square. So from here we see knight to c6, putting another attacker on this pawn, and now bishop to e3, putting yet another defender on this pawn. And from here there are a couple of different directions that the game can go. 2 of the main variations you'll see is castles and castles. So this is where both sides just try to get kingside safety before putting more focus on this pawn. Another variation that you could see is where black moves the queen to c7, which is indirectly attacking this bishop, because after pawn captures, knight captures, bishop captures, or knight captures, this bishop's undefended and the queen can just pick off the bishop. So you'll typically see rook to c1, putting more pressure on the bishop, guarding the bishop so that all the pieces are defended. And this is another variation. You can see it. This opening is very flexible. There's a lot of different directions that both players can go. Another variation for this is called the Seville variation, where you get to it. This was played by Karpov pretty often. It was played 4 times, in fact, on the World Championship match between Kasparov and Karpov in 1987. And from here, we just saw the bishop come to e3. White plays castle, castle, and now black brings the bishop down to g4. As we mentioned before, this doesn't pin the knight anymore, but it is putting pressure on the knight. And so to break the pin, or break the pressure, we see f3, which is pretty natural. I mean, you just have a tendency of just wanting to do that anyway. But from here, we see knight coming to a5, putting pressure on the bishop. So it's really, you take my bishop, and I'll take your bishop kind of situation. And from here, you'll see white capture on f7. So white does gain a pawn in this variation, but many people consider this situation, consider this opening good for black still, even though black's down a pawn. The fact that white has lost their lot toward bishop, and the fact that white's pawn structure is a little bit weak. The king is not quite as safe as he would be because this pawn was moved up initially, and there's just a lot of openings for a lot of attacks. So this is one variation that Karpov plays a lot as white, and it's called the Seville variation. So it's another variation to keep in mind and to maybe consider trying out. So another variation you will see in the Grunfeld that's not related to the exchange variation is bishop to f4 on move 4. There's no actual formal name for it. It's the Grunfeld, which is this. And rather than seeing the capture on d5 like we did in the previous variations, we see bishop to f4, just trying to get more center control and to not lock in the bishop when we move e3. So from here, black again plays bishop to g7. Now we see e3, and now we see c5. And this is to avoid the Grunfeld gambit, which I will go over in just a minute. So I'll explain why this pawn was moved here in just a moment when we go over the gambit. But it really comes down to, if you don't move the pawn, this pawn will be free material later in the game. So from here we just see capture on that pawn, and then the queen coming here, getting ready to gain this material back. And this is the bishop to f4 variation. There's no formal name for it. The gambit, the Grunfeld gambit that I mentioned, is where right here we saw pawn come to c5, but let's say you see, e3, let's say pawn to c5 was played previously. Let's say black castles, or black develops the knight, or anything besides this pawn to c5. It doesn't matter. Now white can win material by c captures on d5, knight captures on d5, knight captures on d5, queen captures on d5, and now that pawn can be picked off by the bishop on c7. And this is called the Grunfeld gambit. Some people think that it's worth it. It's pretty much just letting black get one more turn of development with the price of a pawn. Many people consider it not worth it, that you're better off to just bring the pawn to c5 and not try to gambit off the pawn for development. But that is a gambit that is available if you prefer to not get too far behind in your development as black. The next variation is the only variation that does not go into the Grunfeld main lines, and it's really to avoid the Grunfeld main lines as white. So it'll start out with pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn to c4, and pawn to g6. From here, black, as white, you should be aware that black can bring the bishop here on the following turn, and it'll be the King's Indian, or black can bring the pawn to d5, and that's the Grunfeld. And in both those variations, you see the knight come up to c3 right now, and then black has the option of going into the King's Indian or the Grunfeld, depending on which move. And one way that white can avoid both those openings is by playing, instead of the knight, playing that later and immediately playing g3, which will transpose into the Catalan opening once we see d5, because now we can just see moves like, now we can just see moves like bishop to g3 and e6, and now we transpose into a Catalan opening from white. So this is one way that white can try to, if you don't like playing variations of the Grunfeld as white, this is one way you could try to shift over to a different opening. The final main variation is the Russian variation. And this is the most aggressive variation you can play as white. It gets the queen involved early, so if you really like using your queen and getting her out to the board early on in the game, then this is a variation you might want to try. And it is the Grunfeld. And from here we're going to see knight to f3, just developing another knight. And now typically, as we've seen almost virtually every variation, the bishop comes to g7 next, so that black can castle. From here we're going to see queen to b3, putting a lot of pressure on this pawn, and honestly it's forcing the trade. Black will actually end up losing a pawn if they do not capture immediately. Defending the pawn will not work. So the main variation is just where the pawn just capture and the queen recaptures, followed by castle on black, and e3 by white, just to lend some additional support to this pawn and to allow the bishop access. Instead of e3, there is the option of the bishop coming out first. So there's a few variations inside of just what I've just shown, but this is the main line variation, the book lines. There is a Russian, I guess you can say Russian declined variation, which is where black will actually lose material, and it's where the queen comes here and black chooses not to capture. Let's say black chooses to try to defend this pawn some more with, I don't know, c6 or e6, either one. Play from here could continue. This is very rare. You don't see this very often, but white can win a pawn. And play from here will continue with pawn captures, the pawn captures, and now we're going to see bishop to g5, attacking the knight, trying to force it off the defense of this pawn so that the pawn can be won by white with the pressure that white already has on it. From here you can see the knight develop. The pawn can come here, allowing the bishop more access. You don't have to immediately capture this pawn. It's going to fall no matter what white does. And from here you can just see castles, the knight fall, followed by the pawn falling on d5. So you don't see this line typically, but this is what I'm just going to call the Russian decline line. It's just where black doesn't try to hold on to the pawn, and white is able to win that pawn as a result. So typically you'll see the Russian variation that I showed previously, where black just captures the pawn, and now white has to be careful because black can now just make moves like bishop to e6, gaining tempo on the queen. But again, this is a very aggressive line, so you knew going in that it was going to be kind of wild, a little more not build up your pieces real quick, more like attacking soon. So this is for a more aggressive player in the Grunfeld defense. And these are all the main lines of the Grunfeld defense that you'll see. There are 2 or 3 lines that are really not used anymore that I didn't go over because you typically don't see them. But this is the Grunfeld opening. It's a very there's a lot of theory on it, as far as, like, is giving white the pawn center worth it? Is taking the pawn center in the exchange variation better for white? Many players consider bishop to f4 variation is safer for white, because white only has to make one mistake and then they'll lose material in the exchange variation, and it's a much more complicated variation. So bishop to f4 is considered a safer opening for white in the Grunfeld openings. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something. Try out the Grunfeld, it's a really great opening, and thanks for watching and subscribe.